Oh my gosh, you guys. There's a new version of my favorite retro emulation console. You know, the one that looks like a little Nintendo? This is the Super Console Cube X3. Is it good? Is it better than the original? Is it worse? Does it even work? I will answer all these questions and more in today's episode of TechDweeb's Cheap Android Box Unboxing and Review Chronicles, episode 152, the Super Console Cube X3 in HD. Hello there, I'm TechDweeb, welcome. Thanks for clicking on the video today. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not a Nintendo. Oh, it plays Nintendo games. Don't you worry your pretty little head. Well, your head, anyways. It plays all the old Nintendo games. Heck, it comes with all the old Nintendo games. But that's not all it plays. It also plays Game Boy games, and Super Nintendo games, and Game Boy Advance games, and Atari games, and Sega Genesis games, and arcade games, and even Nintendo 64 games, and PlayStation games, and Dreamcast games. And it does all that despite the fact that it's literally the size of a peanut butter and jam sandwich. Yeah, look, it's almost exactly the same size as a sandwich. But don't get confused and accidentally eat your Nintendo. About a year ago, I reviewed one of my favorite Android-based retro emulation consoles of all time, the Super Console X Cube. I loved it not because it was the best Android console, which it wasn't, but because it looked like a little Nintendo. Call me crazy, but I'd like my retro consoles to look like retro consoles. So I was super excited when kinhank reached out to me and asked me if I'd like to review the new version, which they're calling the Super Console Cube X3. They call it the X3 because this uses the S905X3 chip, which is a bit more powerful than the old S905X chip that was used in the original Super Console X Cube. So how does this new one do? Is it a worthy upgrade? Does it still look like a old school retro Nintendo? Well, yeah, it does. It does look like a Nintendo. You don't need me to tell you that. But is it worth your hard-earned money? Well, let's answer that today, shall we? The unboxing experience is nothing special. A generic box that just says retro video game console. In the box, we're greeted by another box, and in that other box, we get the console itself. We get an Android remote that we're not going to bother using, and the power adapter, of course. Yay, another HDMI cord to add to my pile of unused HDMI cords. And some instructions, really useful instructions like, when you carry this machine out, participate in high-intensity sports such as running, climbing, etc. Please fix the machine firmly on your body to avoid damage caused by falling from a height or squeezing heavy objects. Okay, will do. Also, some other instructions in there if you need them. The device itself is pretty neat, in my opinion. It's a tiny little thing, and it looks like an old Nintendo. Instead of a game cartridge slot, we get 4 hidden USB holes. Around the back, we get a headphone hole, another USB-A hole, microSD card hole. My version is the 256 gigabyte version, by the way, and an HDMI hole, and an Ethernet hole, and a power hole. Inside this thing is the S905X3 chip. 4 gigabytes of LPDDR3 RAM, built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it runs Android 9 and Emulation 4.5. And of course, we get the standard cheap PS2 style wireless controllers. You know, they work. The analog sticks work, the buttons are fine, the D-pad is totally fine. And yeah, not much to say about these, they'll get you by. And you can use other controllers too. I do want to mention here that this version of the Cube has active cooling. There's a fan inside, which sounds like a good thing, but the fan is kinda loud. It doesn't have fan speed control either. It just whirs away the entire time that it's turned on. I mean, if you had this under your TV or something across the room, I doubt you'd even notice it, but I'm not used to noise coming from my Android boxes. I'm actually planning on opening it up and unplugging the fan after I'm done with this review. I don't think the fan is really doing that much anyways. Booting it up, we're greeted by Emulation Station. You could navigate your system list, go into a system to see your games, you could select a game to start it up, and within a few seconds you'll be playing the game, and you can see there are some nice bezels on the side of the screen. There are usually hotkeys to save and load your state, open the menu, and exit the game. I say usually because there was a problem with that here that I needed to fix myself. You can exit the game and then you'll be back in the menu. And then you can press select, go down to advanced system options, and you can change some stuff about the emulation. You can change the emulation core if you need to do that for whatever reason. You can disable the bezels or apply a shader so your screen looks like an old retro CRT monitor. It's all super easy and convenient, and it's just a fun way to play these old games. I love these things because they're just freaking fun. Playing your old favorite retro games and discovering new ones. Now, I do have a few gripes with this particular system that they made here for the Super Console Cube X3. First off, the system was set to run at 720p by default. But a bigger gripe is that the hotkeys weren't bound properly. I had to manually rebind all the hotkeys in RetroArch. This sort of thing is easy for a TechDweeb like me, but I can see lots of people getting stuck up with this issue. At least you can access all those functions you need with L3 and R3, so it's not the end of the world. And subjectively, it's a pretty sluggish feeling compared to what I'm used to on these devices. Just like navigating the menus and games list, everything takes an extra second or two. Not sure what's going on here, but I wanted to mention it. But while there are a few small things I was annoyed about, in the big picture, they're pretty small. And honestly, the system is fine. I'd have no problem using this as my primary emulation device, at least in terms of the system itself. As for the games, though, many of the older retro systems are perfect. NES, for instance, there's no duplicates and mostly English North American releases. Same thing with Game Boy Advance, and it had all the games that I found are sometimes missing on these sorts of devices. But when I opened up Super Nintendo, it was a mess. I had a ton of duplicates and alternate region versions. In this situation, when there's a ton of other regions mixed in, I like to put on a region filter to only show the North American releases. But even then, there's still duplicates. So some of the systems will be perfect, but some will be pretty messy. It's a little bit annoying, but ultimately, it doesn't really take away from the ability to enjoy the device, so I'll give that a pass. At least the ROM sets are fairly complete for the older retro console systems, and they all ran great. Atari, NES, Sega Master System, Game Boy, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, TurboGrafx 16, Game Boy Advance, and even stuff like Sega 32X, all of it ran absolutely perfectly without a single issue. But it's not all good news. Arcade games are one thing that gets easily messed up on devices like this. For example, I figured I'd go into Arcade Classics to try out my favorite old school arcade game, Asteroids. And it didn't work with the default core. So I went through a few of the other cores and found it worked with MAME 2003 Plus. I left that on as the default because most of the games worked with MAME 2003 Plus. Not all of them though. There's a few that you'll need to try other cores. So they obviously used a mixed ROM set here. And at least they had the bezels, with each arcade game gets its own bezel, which I love to see. And I'll give them credit where credit's due. All my favorite arcade games did work. There were a few other issues with the cores in the other arcade sections. I won't list it all, and honestly, most of these Android boxes suffer from lots of these problems. I just wish they'd set these things up correctly. But at least you can get everything working if you try some different emulation cores and options. As always with Nintendo 64 on these cheap emulation boxes, the experience is pretty hit or miss. They do have a complete ROM set, over 250 Nintendo 64 games, all English North American releases, which is good, and lots of them run great. F-Zero X ran perfect. It was holding a constant 60 FPS, so that alone shows me that this new version of the Cube will be performing better than the original. Same thing with Kirby 64 and Monster Truck Madness. But moving up to some harder stuff, we see the problems. Cruisin' USA and Mario Tennis are both a glitchy, stuttery mess. So you can play some Nintendo 64. Probably most of Nintendo 64 will run fine, but some won't. PS1 has 656 games. That's a lot of PS1 games. But you need to know that they've done that thing where they remove the music tracks from lots of the games to save space. That's how they can fit so many on here. At first I thought they were all English games, but I fired up Resident Evil and it was in Portuguese.
O que é isso? Incrível, mas que mansão.
Most of the rest are English though, as far as I could tell. Bloody Roar 2 worked well, which is awesome. That means that you shouldn't have any performance issues running PS1 games. All of these games are going to work well. It couldn't handle any upscaling though, but the widescreen hacks did work. And, you know, it's really nice to play PS1 games in widescreen. Tekken 3 is another hard-to-run game, and it also worked with the widescreen hacks. But again, no music. And that's not a big deal for me, because I tend to put my own music on anyways. But if that's a big deal for you, then this alone might be a deal breaker. We get 24 Sega Saturn games, and Saturn is actually really good if you switch the emulator. Easy stuff runs on the default emulator, which is RetroArch with the Yamasen Shiro core, but you'll run into performance issues with some of the harder stuff there. If you switch the emulator to the standalone version of Yamasen Shiro, it'll work fine. But here we don't have access to the emulator options. There's no hotkey to access them, which is a minor bummer. But at least the games work though. PSP is not great. There's 283 games, but they're mostly PSP mini games. There's a few full games, but their performance isn't great. God of War Ghost of Sparta ran, but they had to lock it at 15 FPS to get it running. Tekken 6 didn't even start. There were games that did work okay. Just don't buy this thing expecting to play a bunch of PSP, but some of it does work.
Alright, climb your way to...
And Dreamcast isn't great. We get 23 Dreamcast games, but they're not all gonna work well. Dead or Alive 2 didn't even start up. Crazy Taxi is an easy to emulate game, but it's running poorly here.
Oh, don't worry. Oh, Taxi!
I tried all the different emulators and cores, and even on the best one, it was still pretty bad. But Power Stone 2 did run well, and that's a good game. So it's not like you can't play some Dreamcast on here. Just don't expect to play all of it. Overall, I'm kinda conflicted about this one. On the one hand, it's got some jank. Issues with the game lists, issues with the configuration on some of the emulators, issues with the performance. I don't like that it has active cooling because the fan is a little bit on the loud side. But on the other hand, this is a cheap emulation console, and it does lots of things right. It generally works fine for the most games and systems, and you can tweak the emulators and cores to get stuff working, and it comes with a lot of games. Complete ROM sets of all the old consoles and lots of the higher end games. And most importantly, it looks like a little Nintendo. And that alone is enough for me to enjoy owning this thing. There are lots of other options out there though, like the original version of the Cube, which is cheaper now, or other consoles by Kinhank or other console makers. I'll leave that up to you, but if you want this one, I'll include a link to where you can buy it in the description below. And that's it for me. I had fun testing this thing out and making the video, and I really appreciate you watching. Click the thumbs up button if you like the video, or don't if you didn't. That's it for me. I'm TechDweeb. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.